to this episode of the University of Michigan Sound Support's 2022 Parent Webinar Summer Series. My name is Kelly Starr. I'm one of the speech-language pathologists here at Michigan Medicine's cochlear implant program. As you may know, Sound Support is an outreach grant funded by the University of Michigan Department of Otolaryngology and Michigan Medicaid. The grant is designed to provide outreach and support to children with hearing loss and their families throughout the state of Michigan. We've put together this series of webinars for parents due to the great responses from past series. If you have any questions, you can reach out to Sound Support at odo-soundsupportci@med.umich.edu. Today's webinar is titled Your Grief Counts, Grief After Your Child's Hearing Loss Diagnosis. I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our presenters, Sierra Larson and Ellen Thomas. Sierra Larson is a social worker at the Cochlear Implant Program on our Sound Support grant and is also at the Tinnitus Clinic and a primary care clinic at Michigan Medicine. Ellen Thomas is a speech-language pathologist and certified auditory verbal therapist here at Michigan Medicine and works with children who are deaf and hard of hearing and their families. And with that, I will hand it over to Sierra and Ellen, and we'll get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Sierra, and we're going to start by talking about some different myths about grief. These are things that people in your life may be saying to you. Maybe you've kind of grown up with this understanding of grief, but there are these cultural ideas about grief that may impact your experience. So one common idea, a myth, is that we deserve to grieve only if someone has died. There is a cultural idea that only in the worst possible situation do we get to feel grief, and otherwise we should, have perspective or continue to feel happy or grateful that things aren't worse. And this is, I'll talk in the next slide about what the reality is as opposed to the myth. But this tends to be a pretty unhelpful idea. Lots of us experience grief in all kinds of situations, and it's not helpful to rank different kinds of grief, some being worse to experience or some being better to experience. So the myth is that we deserve to grieve only if someone has died, but the reality is that if you're going through a situation and experiencing grief, the grief that you're feeling is valid. Another myth is that grief is linear, that we, get through grief from the worst possible experience with it at the very beginning, and then there's a linear progression to feeling better, and that it only exists for a certain amount of time, that you'll have an end date, maybe a year later, where you're expected to be better, to have put it behind you, and to have quote-unquote moved on. And then another myth is that you have to put on a brave face for the rest of your family, that you have to express that you're doing fine, that you're grateful, and that it will benefit others to have you appear strong. But in fact, there are many different kinds of losses that are disenfranchised, meaning that they don't have the kind of social understanding that that is a valid grief. And so people tend to not see it, not acknowledge it. Maybe you have loved ones who are kind of undermining that you're experiencing grief right now, or you yourself may not feel like you get to be grieving. We know that there is this cultural idea that only a death-related loss deserves to be grieved. But in fact, there are many, many different kinds of losses, maybe the absence of an experience you were hoping for, a moment that you didn't get to share with a loved one, a child's future that you're concerned about, or their experience being different than you were expecting. Those are all losses, and if you're experiencing grief, it counts. There isn't a right way or a wrong way to be grieving. Even in grief research, people hear that there are steps to grief, or that there is a correct way to go through this different sequence of emotions. And the grief researchers who come up with those ideas say very carefully that there isn't a formulaic way to grieve, or that there isn't a way to grieve correctly. And so if you're finding that you're feeling angry when others are sad, or if you're feeling frustrated and your loved ones are expecting you to be grateful, that doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. The way that you're going through your grief is valid, and it doesn't mean that you're supposed to be doing something different. There also isn't a correct timeline for grief. Societally, like I said earlier, we sort of expect people to be at a certain point at a certain place in time, but that's not the case. In reality, grief ebbs and flows. It can feel like we're doing well, and then on an anniversary or a birthday or a holiday, we start to feel maybe set back, or we're feeling like we've moved backward with our grief when it's feeling really raw or really present. And we expect, grief researchers understand that grief does work in that way. It's not linear, that there isn't a final timeline for grief, but instead it's something that may ebb and flow in the way that, grief may feel bigger to us certain days than others, but that doesn't mean that we're doing it wrong. And in fact, we do expect it to be something that we carry with us into the future rather than something we're just going to be over one day. As I mentioned, we believe that all grief counts. So if you are experiencing grief about your child's diagnosis of hearing loss or other types of grief in your life, honoring that grief, calling it grief, and sitting with it will probably be better for you than trying to push it down or tell yourself you don't get to feel this way. And then finally, social support helps. So, we may wish to appear strong for our family, but generally people do better when they share with others how they're feeling and they let their grief be seen. Another element about grief is that the context of your grief, the other things that are going on in your life and the world, do matter in our ability to process what we're going through. So if you have other stressors in your life, or you've been through other recent types of grief, this grief is probably going to be harder for you to manage. In the context of the pandemic, a lot of people have gone through a lot of grief, confusion about what to expect, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of losses that are social, things that we sort of took for granted about the way the world works, job loss, loss of loved ones, not being able to see the people we love who are in elder care. And so there is a ton of societal loss and a ton of individual loss, and that makes it harder these days when something affects us. It's in the context of a really difficult last couple of years. There's also ongoing uncertainty and recent losses in terms of like national tragedies, economic insecurity. And so all of that makes this context where this particular grief you might be feeling right now is a little harder to cope with, or maybe significantly harder to cope with, given what else you're going through. This quote comes from Hope Edelman's book called The After Grief. And I think it does a nice job of showing how grief does come with us, that there isn't a set timeline, and that we all experience it a little differently. So I'll read it here. Grief is not an emotion to pass through on the way to feeling better. Instead, grief is in constant motion. It's tidal, easily and often reactivated by memories and sensory events, and is re-triggered as we experience life transitions, anniversaries, and other losses. Whether we want it to or not, grief gets folded into our developing identities, where it informs our thoughts, hopes, expectations, behaviors, and fears, and we carry it forward. You might be hearing unhelpful comments from friends or family after your child receives a hearing loss diagnosis. And I'll mention just a few of them so that you get a sense of if you're hearing these things and they don't feel helpful to you, that is okay. So any sentence that starts with the phrase "at least" is probably not going to make us feel much better. Generally, people say this to try to help give some perspective or to shed light on the things that are going well. But if you're at a place in your experience with your child's hearing loss that any sentence with "at least" doesn't feel helpful, it is okay. We don't have to feel the way other people are asking us to feel. People also may say, you should just be happy for her. Or, I know that things are going to be okay in the future. If you hear sentences like that, other people predicting the future or trying to help you have perspective, it is okay if those things don't feel helpful right now in the place that you are with moving through your child's diagnosis. Other times, relatives or friends may provide their input about what they think is happening with your child's hearing loss. We often hear relatives share that they think the kid can hear just fine. If you're hearing things like that, it's okay to not find it helpful. We know that you're going through input from lots of different people in your lives about what they think may be happening or what decisions you should make. Know that you're welcome to process those questions that are brought up for you when you hear other people's input with your team. But we know that it can be really challenging to sort through all of this information, all of this input, all of this advice from people in your life who may not have the facts and information that you've received from your child's medical providers. Grief can feel absolutely enormous sometimes. It can ebb and flow and feel enormous at times that are unexpected. Sometimes it feels enormous when we have to get through our day. And so we do what we can to put it aside, just to keep going. But if you're feeling like your grief is really big for you, it may be worth connecting with some support, whether it's a professional grief support, connecting with social work at our clinic, just to get some additional resources and have somewhere to put the grief that you're going through. And then also, you can absolutely love your child deeply and still be grieving their hearing loss or anything about their development that isn't going the way that you expected or the way that you hoped for them. We can have these multiple feelings at once where we do feel genuine love, and we're also feeling frustrated or sad or wishing that things were different. So if you are going through grief, it does not matter that it does not make you a bad parent or make you less loving of your child. Grief is just complicated, and grief shows up when we had different expectations than the way things are turning out.
Thank you, Sierra. I'm Ellen Thomas, and I'm going to talk to you about one of the unexpected events that occurs when you have a child with a hearing loss who is going through the cochlear implant process, which is a process that involves a lot. I can only imagine how a family must feel as they get into the implant process and they have professionals who are giving them tons of information and a timeline that seems rushed, an appointment after an appointment, while as a family, you're still trying to wrap your heads around your newest family member and what life looks like with this new addition. For a child with a hearing loss, when they get good access to the full spectrum of sound for speech and language is unfortunately really a time-sensitive issue. And the outcome that this child will have in terms of listening and spoken language and their comfort with sound has a lot to do with when they first get that access. So we're presented with a situation where there are two different timetables and they don't usually really line up well. From the baby's perspective on their timetable, this is a neurodevelopmental emergency. We need to get sound in, we need to get language in, and the sooner it happens, the better the outcome and the faster that the learning will happen and that the child will be able to achieve a range of communication that's typical for their chronologic age. And really, it doesn't matter what communication option a family chooses, whether it's listening and spoken language or whether it's a visual communication like American Sign Language, all routes take work. And for instance, unless a family is really fluent in ASL, there's a lot to do to get up and running with ASL if that is the route a family has chosen. So this timetable for the baby is one that things need to happen quickly for. For an adult, 3 months is not that long a time period, whereas for childhood development, it really is quite a significant span of time. So in terms of the parent timetable, we're looking at you as a family, and you've just added a new member to the family. And being the parent of a young child, especially in their first year of life, is absolutely exhausting. And you're running on very little a lot of the time. So adding the fact that you're having to make important decisions about your child's future feels justifiably overwhelming. When we're looking at cochlear implantation for a young child and getting access to sound, it's really about the brain and the critical period between birth to age 3 in which all these connections form to support listening and spoken language. And it's very clear from research and what we've seen throughout the history of cochlear implants that timing really does matter, and that the earlier a child is able to get access to sound and get a base for future language development, the better the prognosis and the easier things become in terms of language acquisition later on. It's not that nothing can happen after 3, a lot certainly does, but if we're looking at taking the easiest and ultimately probably most successful route for a child, then earlier is really critical. Once we get parents through the preoperative process for implants and the surgery, which for any parent is definitely nerve-wracking, then we start harping on full-time device use. And this is tough, but full-time device use is the first and most important goal for getting that hearing foundation that leads to all these other things in life. And it's easy to let your emotions get in the way and to feel sorry for the child, or to, despite what you've been told, wonder if it might be hurting them. It's not. And it helps sometimes to think in terms of the other things we do in parenting that are non-negotiable behaviors with a child. For instance, most of us enforce riding in a car seat, and I have really yet to meet a toddler that thought that was a great idea. We generally enforce wearing clothes and not biting, not hitting. These are things that we as parents will direct the child toward a different behavior or maintaining a behavior, because to us these are non-negotiable. So if we think about device use as the key to the child's education and communication and opportunity to have choices in life, then we start to see why this too should be a non-negotiable behavior. And ultimately, the sooner that you can get the child used to wearing devices and comfortable with them, then the easier the rest of the road is. But I have to say that doesn't help you when you're in the middle of putting a device on 50 times an hour. We do get it, but we also know what the cost benefit is. And hopefully you start to understand too where we're coming from in terms of the benefit is so great that putting that device on for the 99th time in a minute is actually worthwhile. This too shall pass. So here's some things to consider to sort of help you navigate through this difficult transition time into cochlear implant use. One is that it's a front-end loaded process. The bulk of the work happens at the front end. We wish it was different, but that's how it is. And it will never be easier than now to get device use established and get to a great outcome. The window of opportunity for language learning does close. We're so excited when we see a family in this window that we can still offer a great prognosis for developing listening and spoken language. Another consideration as you're exhausted and working through this is that ultimately this payoff is for a lifetime. It's an exhausting investment, but the results last a lifetime. And one last thing to consider is, what are the alternatives? So if you don't get full-time device use and you don't push for that, what does that mean? Well, it probably means that it will take longer to establish listening and spoken language, that the child will be delayed, and the amount of the delay will directly correlate to how much they've been able to use the device and the intervention that is received or not received. And so ultimately, the alternative is more time for a longer period with probably not as great outcomes as can be established with early implantation and early device use and early intervention. Life just isn't easy on any front for the most part. As your implant team, we really do know this is tough and encourage you to talk to us openly. We've been down this road with lots of families, and we can listen. We can sometimes provide suggestions, and we can just commiserate that, yeah, sometimes it really stinks. But at the other side of this is a reward that's worth pursuing. And so talk with us and let us commiserate with you. Let us encourage you and keep things moving forward for that outcome that you're looking for your child.
Your child may also grieve in the future as they develop their sense of self. Often as kids are emerging into their teen years and experiencing relationships with peers, your child may go through grief as well about their hearing loss. While they're in elementary school, there's an excellent resource available at most schools. Teacher consultants of the deaf and hard of hearing help with self-advocacy and your child's understanding of their hearing loss. So as you're navigating their hearing loss and they're growing up, the teacher consultants are a really excellent resource to connect with to help them relate to their hearing loss and ask for what they need while they're at school. As I mentioned, children, grieve on their own timetable. It doesn't always happen at a particular age, or it doesn't always happen for every child. But as you're thinking about your own grief, let this be a reminder that your kid may go through something similar or some different kind of grief in their future. If there is a time where you or your child experiencing grief or otherwise is experiencing mental health symptoms that are concerning for them or for you, I want to share a couple of 24/7 resources that you can connect with. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24/7. Their number is 1-800-273-8255. Michigan Medicine also has a 24/7 psychiatric emergency services telephone number. You may also hear that referred to as PES, and that number is 734-936-5900. We always recommend reaching out for help if you feel like you're struggling and you'd benefit from talking with someone about what you're going through. Adolescence is a challenging time in life for most people, and parents can help by offering to speak with your child about their mood or by connecting them with a mental health professional. This 2021 study specifically looked at the prevalence of depression and anxiety in adolescents with hearing loss. And it found that a quarter of the adolescents surveyed scored above the clinical cutoff, meaning that they had a diagnostic level of at least one measure for depression or anxiety. And 10% scored in the elevated range for both depression and anxiety measures. 21% of the population scored in the at-risk range for depression and anxiety, meaning that they wouldn't have a diagnosable level of anxiety or depression. They wouldn't meet all of the criteria, but they do have some symptoms of either of those diagnoses. And what that research showed is that adolescents with more significant hearing loss, for example, adolescents with severe to profound hearing loss, had higher rates of depression and anxiety. So there is a correlation between the severity of hearing loss and the likelihood and severity of those mental health symptoms. So knowing, what your child's diagnosis is, maybe knowing the grief or experience that you're having in this moment, keep that in mind for when they're going through their adolescence, because this doesn't, of course, mean that every child is going to experience depression or anxiety, but most people in their adolescence go through a hard time, and your child has some additional risk factors given their hearing loss. So being aware of this, keep this in mind for the future, and if you notice that your child is struggling, or if you're just not sure, it's a good idea to talk to them, maybe have them talk to their doctor or get them connected with some mental health support. With any questions about this webinar, feel free to email soundsupport@odo-soundsupportci@med.umich.edu. Thank you for listening.